Time for Launch made me think about courage because, much like you, when I was growing up, I heard lots of stories. I love stories. Stories to entertain, stories to educate, and some of the ones that probably captivated me the most were stories about courage. And that courage is often shown from adults, whether they be astronauts or authors or statesmen or soldiers, a variety of different people who became famous not just for what they did, but for who they were. One of the common denominators with all of those people we read about in school or my parents told me about is they were adults. So it seems if they were preparing to launch, we already got the launch place. We didn't get what happened beforehand. My presentation really is that courage can roar, which is what I certainly heard about in those stories and often is the climax of a story, but it's also a whisper that can say to keep going. I've defined courage pretty much the way the dictionary has: strength that can withstand fear, danger, and you're going to hear about 3 young people today that I'm going to talk to you about with courage because today's theme is TEDxYouth. And so we're going to be looking at 3 young people today. The first one I'd like to share with you, the first young woman I'd like to share with you, you probably haven't heard about, and I've only recently became aware of her myself. Her name is Claudette Colvin, and as you can see, that photo was taken quite some time ago. Claudette grew up in Montgomery, Alabama in the 1950s. What was unique about Montgomery, Alabama, and other parts of the South of the United States at that time is that it was segregated. And the public bus transit system was segregated between black people and white people or African Americans. Basically, the African Americans or blacks were forced to sit in the back, the whites in the front. Even more insulting is when the bus became crowded, blacks were required by law to vacate their seat for a white person. Now, as you can imagine, Claudette is a teenager growing up in Montgomery, Alabama, in the middle of the beginning of the civil rights movement around America, that her courage was beginning to whisper, saying, this isn't right, and I need to do something about this. And it wasn't long before she was coming home on the bus one day, the public bus from school, 1955, where the bus did become crowded, where she was required by the bus driver to vacate her seat, and she refused. And as you can see from this newspaper article at that time, she was arrested. She was arrested for assault, battery, and disorderly conduct. Now, she and 4 other plaintiffs actually sued the city of Montgomery, Alabama, and the state, alleging that racial segregation in the public transit system was unconstitutional. Now, just imagine the courage it would have taken for a black 15-year-old girl in Alabama in 1955 to head to a federal court, face 3 judges, 3 white male judges, to go ahead and plead her case. Well, fortunately, those judges saw right and declared the racial segregation of the bus system in Montgomery as unconstitutional. But the state of Alabama appealed, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. When it reached the Supreme Court also heard the case, also came back a few months later with the same decision. It is, in fact, unconstitutional to go ahead and segregate people based on race. They ordered the city of Montgomery and the state of Alabama to go ahead and change their laws, and what ended then, what had become very famous across America and the civil rights movement around the world, was the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott. Why that was such a big deal is those African-American people really relied on buses to get to and from work. So during that bus boycott, they had to manage other ways to get to and from work. I share this with you for a couple reasons. One, Claudette's a hero. She's a pioneering hero, but you've never heard of her, and honestly, neither did I till recently. The reason her story was buried is because Claudette, not only was she young and 15, but she was unmarried and pregnant when this case was happening, which was a huge social stigma in both the black and white community, just about everywhere you'd want to be in America in the 1950s. The Civil Rights Committee at that time decided to go ahead and put her name in the background for this, and instead put a much more famous name that we've all heard. Rosa Parks is the name we associate with ending the bus discrimination and the beginning of the civil rights movement in the South. Rosa was older. She was arrested 9 months later for the same incident. But I share that with you for 2 reasons. One, we have a pioneering teenager who heard the whisper to courage. She launched her courage by speaking out and took quite a risk. She was arrested, and again, even though the case went to her favor, She did wind up moving from Montgomery, Alabama, unfortunately, because within her own community she couldn't find work and she was labeled a troublemaker. People didn't want to be associated with her because of the stigma that still, even though it had been a victory in the civil rights movement. So having courage is important, and you all have it inside you, but it could come with risks. The next person you're going to recognize, because she's a young lady who's made herself quite famous internationally, and now she's actually 20. She's just turned 20 this month, since I prepared that slide for the team here. Greta, as you know, is a Swedish activist, a teen activist. Though she's 20, she started when she was actually much younger. She started at home, trying to convince her parents to reduce their carbon footprint at home. So her conscience, her courage was whispering at home, encouraging her parents to have a different lifestyle. That paid off, and she went out at 15, also, like Claudette, 15 years old. You started first seeing her on social media, standing in front of the Swedish Parliament with a sign that said, "Student Strike for Climate." This was in August of 2018. Now, the tool that Greta had that Claudette didn't was social media. Because as soon as Greta started posting these, herself protesting and striking, taking the student strike about climate change on the web, it went viral, and the numbers only grew. From 2018 till in August, when she started, till she first addressed the UN Climate Conference that year, there were students all over the world taking place in this. And they also organized a group called Fridays for Future, where over 1 million students worldwide went ahead and campaigned for climate change, speaking up for that, particularly for the fact challenging governments and elected officials for not doing enough, which is what got Greta even more famous when she was invited in 2019 to the UN conference in the United States, where she chose not to fly because of the carbon footprint. She took a yacht, went over and spoke there, and gave that very famous speech, "How dare you?" which you can still find on YouTube. Basically, how dare leaders in government, how dare elected officials, how dare basically anybody who's over 21 years old who is in a position of authority and power for not having done more. Now, social media, as you well know, cuts both ways. Social media got her international exposure and got her message out. But you've got to imagine the horrific abuse that she also took on social media. From people her own age, from people around the world, other leaders. It took a huge amount of courage to continue to persevere. Again, the danger that may come with that, the personal challenges that may come with her being able to do so. What also makes her case very unique is that she saw a global challenge. There are other teenagers who have spoken up for sexual violence, gun violence, education disparities across the world. And they've got headlines because it's important work, but it's often been instigated by personal crisis and personal loss, personal tragedy. What Greta's situation is different because she's seeing a global issue. As a matter of fact, it's exactly what the IB encourages us to do in a philosophy of to think globally but act locally. That's what Greta's trying to inspire teenagers to do. As a matter of fact, the press has called it the Greta Effect. The effect of being able, by her power of persuasion on the internet and what she's doing, to inspire students all over the world, millions now, to follow in her footsteps. Now, one of the criticisms that she rightly absorbs is the fact that she is very direct. She is difficult to go ahead, and she's uncompromising. And she also shares proudly that she has a diagnosis of Asperger's, which is on the autism spectrum disorder. She identifies that, harnesses that as her own for those who criticize her speech and criticize her awkwardness. In addition, she is also takes pride in her diagnosis for obsessive compulsive disorder, saying this is just, I'm different. Other people may see it as a medical diagnosis of being something wrong with me, but this I harness as my difference and what she's been able to put, what she calls it, her superpower. Now, she's had many different awards. The ones that stick out for me is she's the youngest person to get the Time Magazine of the Year award, and where they focus one person a year. In addition, she's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, not just in 2019, but also 2020, 21, and 22. Now, if you keep up with the news, you know Greta just got arrested. She's just been arrested in Germany for going ahead and speaking up at, there's some coal mining now that they're looking to start up again or expand in Germany. Is it yet sort of seeking another coal source? As you know, that's one of the more dirtier elements to go ahead and produce energy. So we haven't seen the end of Greta and what she's doing. Again, her quiet whisper of courage spoke to a roar once she was able to develop a platform. And the last person I want to share with you is someone you don't know and someone you'll probably never meet, but his name is Yono and he's from Tanzania. Yono's dad works as a merchant. He sells nylon, he sells plastics. His mother works as a peasant farmer, and together they sell their wares daily, but it's never quite enough to feed their family of 8. When Yono was born, he was the third in the family. His parents realized straight away something was very wrong, because both of his parents are Tanzanian, and therefore their skin pigmentation is as dark as these guys standing here with Yono, which are his classmates, by the way. So when they got the diagnosis from the hospital that he had albinism, they were worried. They were deeply worried for 2 reasons. One, the medical expenses that come with someone who has this kind of fair skin, because you know what albinism is, it's a lack of an enzyme called melanin. And that melanin is what gives us our skin color, our skin pigment color, our hair color, and eye color. So there'd be medical expenses associated with that, but there's also a social stigma because he's different. And in a traditional society, someone who looks that different can create problems, especially in some traditional cultures, such as in parts of Tanzania, where basically an albino gets one of 2 reactions. The first reaction is fear, because they're believed to be cursed, that there's something wrong with them and they therefore can bring a bad omen or bad will to a community. The second and more terrifying situation is the fact that in Tanzania and other parts of Africa, albinos are murdered or maimed for their body parts because it is believed that their body parts can go ahead and bring about good wealth and good fortune. Over 70 albinos in Tanzania have been murdered and others maimed as a result of this lucrative black market practice. So Yono's parents knew that it was a dire situation for them to have an albino child and very worried about what to do about him. Now, fortunately, the government of Tanzania woke up and said we need to not only investigate these murders and this maiming of our citizens, but we also must go ahead and provide sanctuary for children such as this. Fortunately, at 5 years old, Yono got into one of these shelters. It was called the Compassion Project. And from 5 to his teenage years, about 16 here, he was going ahead and trained not just in schooling, which was of course essential for him to be able to have some education, but also the care of protection, so he could hear the whisper of his own courage. Because Yono has to have the courage to leave the house every day because of what could happen to him, and be able to go ahead and have the strength of character to go ahead and do what he always wanted to do. He said he's always been interested in the sciences. He wants to be a chemical engineer. He did very well in school, even though he was limited with some of his physical disabilities, but which he never saw as a disability. He championed those himself with the help of the mentors around him, the people who loved and supported him. So everybody had a role there. So as I end here today, we talk about our ready to launch. I'm saying what the whisper for courage is inside all of you right now. You don't have to wait for something. Those stories I heard as a child as of adults being with great courage, you just heard 3 very different stories of 3 very different young people, 15, 16 years old, who have gone ahead and made a difference for themselves, for their community, and sometimes even the world by listening to that and following their courage. You have it within you. We believe in you, and we're very pleased to go ahead and consider you part of our RCHK family. Thank you so much.